Do you really want feedback? In this world of self-tapes, wouldn't it be nice to get feedback on every audition? Maybe, maybe not. Let's unpack this, and I'll end with my secret to success. That's not such a secret. Hey everyone, I'm Matthew Cornwell with Get Taped here in Atlanta, Georgia, one of Atlanta's original audition taping services, which I co-own with my amazingly talented, beautiful wife and best friend, Brooke. Okay, in the top 5 all-time complaints from actors, at least since self-taping really began, one of those top 5 complaints would have to be the lack of feedback when having to self-tape all the time. It's a big source of consternation. In fact, tonight is the SAG Awards. I'm taping this before the award ceremony, and Brooke and I are going to a party hosted by our Atlanta local to watch the awards. And while I expect there to be mirth and merriment aplenty, I also expect that somewhere, someone at that party will be talking about the state of the industry and how heavy it is lately, and will likely also start to complain about the lack of feedback with self-tape auditions. I get it. You need your ego stroked. So do I. So let's unpack this need for validation or feedback. Think of yourself as a business. You make a product, your performances, and quite often, hopefully, you get requested to display your product auditions, but your actual sales, your bookings are maybe down year over year, or maybe you haven't really had any sales yet. Or you've had some success with your lemonade stand in your front yard, i.e. indie films or student films, but you haven't had any success taking your product to market yet. So in this warped, weird metaphor, of course, your company would crave feedback. If you have a lemonade product, then you need to know if it's too tart for the average consumer. But arguably, you wouldn't wait until the product is at market before you start to solicit that feedback. You do test groups, private tastings to make sure that you know what you have before you start to push it out to the public. In the acting world, that means you should be getting feedback from teachers, coaches, mentors, behind the scenes, in the shadows, before you come out into the light and showcase this talent for casting, for producers, etc. But let me go back to one of my favorite analogies. Imagine that you're painting an accent wall in your house. Now, the house is built, the rest of the walls are painted, your decor is already chosen and in place, you have this entire color palette, but you just want to change the color of that one wall. So as you consider the color for this accent wall, you can't just randomly choose a color. You have an established palette for the rest of the house. It has to coalesce with that. It has to be complementary to the rest of that design. So as you go to the paint store, you have ideas already about warm versus cool, matte versus glossy, something that might pop versus something that's a little bit more subtle. So you get to the paint store and you grab a bunch of swatches based on these initial ideas and you take them home. And as you get home and start holding up those swatches against the other colors in your house, immediately some of those colors get tossed out of the mix. It doesn't mean that those are bad colors inherently. It just means that in context of the rest of your palette, it's just not going to work. It's going to clash. Now, some of the other swatches get additional consideration, and you might even really secretly be in love with a couple of them. But when you do hold it up against this one particular color, or when you push your couch back up against the wall, you're just not sure. So you take some of these final considerations and maybe you go back to the paint store and get actual samples. You go back to your wall and you paint the sample colors right onto the wall to see how it's going to look when it's dried. And then you can really tell how it's going to either jibe with the rest of your color palette or clash. And if you haven't figured out the relevance of this metaphor as an actor, well, I'll wait. Never mind, I'll explain. You as the actor are that paint swatch in the store. The house is the production, and then the other existing paint colors, that's the other cast, the leads, the series regulars that are already in place. So what's the takeaway with this? It's a pretty obvious metaphor. Well, go back to the paint store and imagine that as you are going back to the store to choose the paint that you wanted, in lieu of all the other ones, and there's a rep there for one of the swatches, one of the paint colors you didn't choose, and that rep says, hey, why didn't you choose us this color? We would love some feedback. Would you have a good answer? Probably not. You'd probably say, no, I love the color. That's why I chose it in the first place. It's just, it didn't quite fit with the rest of my color palette. But maybe next time. Great feedback. How does this help other actors or Other paint swatches. Should Midnight Crustacean try to now change its shade of blue because it wasn't picked for that one house, for that one wall? No, because Midnight Crustacean, I don't even know if that's a real color, will be perfect for some future project eventually. And then for another project, and then for another project. But think of how many customers will come into that paint store who won't need Midnight Crustacean. Does that mean, once again, that Midnight Crustacean is somehow less than of a paint, less than of a color? No. So now let's just talk about being an actor. If you audition for a project and don't get it, well, statistically speaking, that was expected. So to lament over the lack of feedback, is it a waste of time? Perhaps. Because even if you could get that coveted feedback for that one audition from that one casting director, it would likely sound the same as it did in my paint swatch metaphor. We love Matt. That's why we asked to see him. Turns out, though, he's just too young for this role, or too old for this role, or we decided to go in a different direction, etc. And warning, if you were to press harder for actual feedback on the audition itself, you might end up replacing a cheerleader with a critic. And let me explain. First, you have to subscribe to the idea that casting loves you, because they do. They really do. They would not be in this business if they didn't like actors, if their sole purpose in life was to make our lives harder. When they selected your headshot, it's because they want to see your tape. And when they see your tape, they want to press play and watch it. They can't wait to see what you brought to the role. They hope you are the solution to this role. They are your cheerleader. But if you force them to now go back and look at that same audition through the lens of what went wrong, well, now you're making them consciously look for the things that are wrong with your audition. And they might start noticing how much you waddle. Take a look at last week's video in your audition, or how much you blink, or how your emotional choice, maybe upon reflection, wasn't quite deep enough. So suddenly your cheerleader, the person who was rooting for you to book that role, is now being forced to get critical about your work. So what do you think is going to happen the next time they see one of your audition tapes? Are they going to be in that cheerleader mindset, or are they now going to be obsessed with how much you blink in your auditions? So be careful, because you may turn a cheerleader into a critic. Asking for this type of feedback should be reserved for your teachers, your mentors, your coaches, your trusted peers, the person who is your reader, who is maybe 5 steps further ahead in their career than you are. But maybe the casting directors aren't the ones that we should be bugging for this type of feedback. But Matt, okay, you've clarified what feedback is. So I want to clarify that my problem is I want direction. I crave direction. After all, they are casting directors, right? Right? Fair point. But for those actors watching who are old enough to remember when all auditions were in person, think about the actual direction that you got in those auditions. On occasion, it was revelatory and may have been the crucial bit of information that helped you book the part. But even in the self-tape world, if you look right and you're off by just a little bit because you don't have all that information, please trust that casting will reach out and ask you to retape. But most of the time, even in person, the redirect that you got was so subtle, and it may have just been so that they didn't feel like they were wasting your time with just one take, and they were just giving you that second take out of courtesy, even though they didn't need it, just to stroke your ego. There were times when I only got one take in the room. That was weird. Sometimes even at the callback, I only got one take in front of the director. And to be clear, if you had to do 7, 8, 9 takes in person, that's probably not a good sign. That might mean there were some issues with your craft, with your foundation, and you might have been leaving a slightly bad taste in the mouth with that casting director, especially if you noticed that you didn't get many auditions after that with that particular office. So if you're following along and if you're sort of nodding in agreement that you don't really need feedback from casting, and perhaps you didn't need direction as much as you once thought, then maybe all you're really missing is just physically being in the room with another human being. To which I say, I get it. That was the time when you did feel like you were building a connection, a personal connection, a relationship with that person. And for those of you who have joined this world of acting, this TV and film industry, after the point where things move to self-tape and you've never met a casting director in person, I do feel for you. It is a tougher environment for you to enter into nowadays than it was, say, 15, 20 years ago. But the counterpoint to that is there are a few casting directors that I never met in the before times when things were in person. My relationship was purely digital with them from the start. And yet, when I look at my relationship with them now, somehow I was able to develop a relationship. I know who they are in person. I've met them in person, and I have a rapport with them. Isn't that curious? Now, I'm not trying to refute all of you out there who are lamenting the lack of in-person auditions. I'm just saying that if you really start to ask yourself why, and then like a 5-year-old, keep asking why, you might eventually reveal a different cause to this feeling, this anger, this sadness, this resentment of an industry. And there's one more piece of this puzzle that I do want to address, which is when you don't get anything back, no feedback, no callback, no booking. How do you know that what you're putting out there into the ether isn't just getting discounted, thrown away? And I'm not talking about the 4-second controversy. I'm just talking about that void, that vacuum of information. Well, if you received an audition from a casting director 5 years ago and never got one since, well, that is information in and of itself that perhaps there's a disconnect with that office, and maybe it's time to have your reps reach out to that office and ask for legitimate feedback as to why you have not been requested in 5 years. But if the casting office in question continues to call you back month after month, year after year, there's nothing wrong. There is no issue. There is no feedback to get from them. They love you. That's why they keep calling you back in. And so my final point is that you need to be able to self-monitor your own work. Now, that's very difficult in the early days of your career, especially when you haven't had those years of training yet. But I will say that if you take the Sam Christensen image process with Brooke and myself, it could be revelatory like it was for her, for me, and for hundreds of other graduates of this program. It is the secret to my success that I alluded to at the opening. I took the process in 2011 with the late Sam Christensen, and it's the gift that keeps on giving. By discovering what we call my signature performance, I am now able to self-monitor in my auditions. That means I know when I'm showing up authentically without even having to watch playback. And when I do watch it back, I know what the feedback would be if I asked for it. And so there's no point in me asking for it. I can fix the things that I need to fix because I have a solid foundation of craft. And I also know when I'm putting a hat on a hat, when I'm not being charismatic, I'm being extra. And when I need to maybe dial it back, dial in my choices. And if I watch it back and I can objectively say, yeah, I'm being authentic. I'm being charismatic. I showed up as myself today and fulfilled the role to the best of my ability, then I'm able to let it go. And that is powerful. See, it's not just improved my auditions and therefore increased my bookings. Of course, that's not something that I can guarantee for anyone. But just as importantly, it's improved my mindset, my ability to stay sane in an insane industry. And as many of you have already figured out by now, this industry, this career is a war of attrition. To be clear, it's a war against yourself, not a war against casting or fellow actors, but instead a war against the intrusive thoughts in your mind that try to tell you that you're less than or not worthy, or there must be a better choice, or there's an actor that you need to figure out what they do so you can emulate it and be just like them and book just like them. If you don't have a solid system in place for combating these intrusive thoughts, then I invite you to join us at one of our free Sam Christensen image process preview events. Our next one's actually tomorrow. Well, depending on when you're watching this video. It's Tuesday, February 25th, 2025 at 7 p.m. Eastern. Please adjust for your time zone. All the details are in the show notes below. And if you're watching this after that time and you missed the preview, but you're really interested in our March workshop dates, then check the show notes below. There's more information and also an email address that you can reach out to us immediately to get any sort of information that you need or questions answered prior to those dates. All right, that's it for now. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you on set.